All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA INSS PRISM speaker session entitled Economics, Diplomacy, and Great Power Competition. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Honorable Robert Zoellick, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So as usual, we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or after the brief, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 has a question mark. Also, be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you'd like to submit your question anonymously, you can go ahead and click the anonymous button. Also, you can vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to today's moderator, Mr. Michael McCloudkick, who's the lead editor of National Defense University's PRISM Journal, to kick things off. So Mr. McCloudkick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Welcome to the 5th session of the INSS PRISM web seminars for NDU faculty and NDU friends, presented in collaboration with and on the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team platform. Please note that the session is being recorded for future classroom use. As I've said before, when we discuss power in international relations, we often refer to the DIME framework, diplomacy, information, military, and economic. But analysis frequently defaults to the military dimension of national strength. So this series explores the other elements of national power. And for this session, we're fortunate to have the Honorable Robert Zoellick, who in his distinguished career has served as the U.S. Trade Representative, the Deputy Secretary of State, Counselor to the State Department, and the President of the World Bank. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team. Thank you for your support, Nicole, Mariah, Todd. And Mr. Zoellick's bio is posted, so I won't bore you with that. I think I'll just go ahead and invite you to begin your comments, Mr. Zoellick, and then I have a few questions that I'll pose after you're done, and then we'll go to the open discussion. So over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thanks as well to Todd, Nicole, Mariah. I believe I had an opportunity to be with some of you with General Petraeus late last year about a book that I'd written, America and the World, a history of U.S. diplomacy and foreign policy. So I have a special thanks for the invitation to be back with you. As I mentioned on that day, I have great respect for all of your contributions and achievements, and I know from experience you're going to be playing leading roles in years ahead. So I consider this opportunity to be with you a privilege. And I know that there's some non-Americans in the class as well, and I just want to say personally how delighted I am that you'd have decided to join with us in one of our country's most prestigious institutions. So today I wanted to take a little different course than the one we did with General Petraeus. I wanted to speak about the Sino-American relationship, a bit about history, the recent past, and then some considerations today. So let me set the stage with 3 recurring themes about U.S.-Chinese relations over the years. First, in 1784, so shortly after our revolution and even before the creation of our Constitution, an American merchant ship, the Empress of China, sailed from New York to China with 40 tons of ginseng from the Appalachian Mountains. The voyage turned a profit of 400%. And ever since that expedition, Americans have dreamed of the commercial potential of China in a very vast market. I have a book downstairs in my basement that was published in 1937 titled 400 Million Customers. But alas, the vision of great profit often shimmered just over the horizon. Second, from the very earliest days of America as a country with global influence, so I would associate that with about the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, the U.S. viewed China as a potential actor of note. Now, of course, in this early phase, China was quite weak. And in 1899-1900, Secretary of State John Hay issued some open door notes that sought to preserve the Qing dynasty's territorial integrity as Europeans, Russians, and Japanese threatened to carve up China just like they had done with sub-Saharan Africa a decade or so before. In the 1920s, the United States supported the Chinese nationalist government's efforts to unite and modernize the country. And some of you that have studied World War II history know that Franklin Roosevelt imagined that China would be one of the four policemen, along with the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain, that would safeguard the post-World War world. And third, another theme that's often overlooked today but remains quite important is that in the 19th and 20th century, American missionaries sought to convert China to Christianity. These missionaries also founded schools and hospitals. They brought young Chinese to America to study. And their influence was quite significant over the years because the missionaries and their children became the interpreters of China for the American public, as novelists such as Pearl Buck, who won Nobel Prize and Prize for Literature and had her book, The Good Earth, made into an extremely popular movie, journalists from Time magazine to others, diplomats, including recent American ambassadors or the children of missionaries, and of course, professors around the world. And it's interesting, more than any other country I know, Americans seem to want to convert the Chinese to Christianity, to capitalism, to small R republicanism. But when the Chinese turned away, as they did in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, or the Communist Revolution of 1949 and the Korean War of 50 to 53, or frankly in Tiananmen Square in 1989, perhaps today as well, the American public attitudes towards China swung like a pendulum towards hostility. In a sense, it was the herd of proselytizers who felt rejected. So one of America's ongoing challenges with China is seeing the country for what it is, not for what we hope it to be or what we wish it to be. Now, in 1971 and 72, President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger launched an opening to China after 20 years in which we didn't even have diplomatic ties. Now, Nixon viewed his initiative as a bold move, and in part, as any strategic initiative would be, it reflected the context. He was trying to reposition U.S. power relations after the conclusion of a long, disappointing, and ultimately defeated war in Vietnam. He also wanted to gain leverage over the Soviet Union through what he called a triangular diplomacy that tried to place the United States closer to both communist powers than either was to one another. But he also recognized, and I quote, "No one could run the world without working with China." And that was in accord with the second theme that I just explained. Nixon believed that China would be a major international actor. Now, that Nixon-Kissinger strategic concept guided American thinking towards China through the end of the Cold War in Europe. That was 1989 and 90. Under China's Deng Xiaoping, however, the other two themes that I mentioned, of commercial prospects and conversion, reemerged because of Deng Xiaoping's push for China's opening up and reform. In 1989, and the history on this is still murky, there appears to have been differences within the Chinese leadership about the nature of political reform, matching some of those that had occurred in the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact in that time, until June of 1989, when the Communist Chinese Party demonstrated brutally its commitment to maintaining a monopoly on power. Now, the Cold War came to a peaceful end in Europe in 1989-90, so we see that as a historical event, but it assumed a different course in Asia, and that's a point I'll return to in a little bit. Now, Deng Xiaoping restarted China's economic reforms in 1991, and the United States, Europe, and Japan, and others tried again to integrate China into the post-Cold War system during the 1990s and 2000s. Now, today, you'll hear arguments from some that that effort at integration was a mistake. But consider this in a longer-term historical perspective. After major wars and shifts in world order, the victors have to decide how to treat their foes. So in 1815, after the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, the Concert of Europe created a long peace by reintegrating France into the political order. After 1945, the United States followed such a strategy for Germany and Japan. But in contrast, in 1919, after World War I, the victors failed to integrate Germany and the Soviet Union. And on top of that, Japan developed a sense of isolation that led to an imperial militarism. And within 20 years, the world was inflamed again. So this is an issue that is important to recall as you think about global strategy. Statesmen often have to face a challenge. If powers cannot operate effectively and with security within a world order, you have to expect they're going to create a alternative and competing system, as that is what the Soviet Union did for 40 years in the Cold War. Now, in 2005, I was serving as the Deputy Secretary of State, and I led the first of what were strategic dialogues with China. And during that time, I gave a speech urging China to become, quote, a responsible stakeholder. And let me explain the context of that. By that time, China had joined the world system, including its membership on the UN Security Council, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and agreements ranging from ozone depletion to nuclear weapons. And indeed, I made the case that it was that international system that had enabled China's success with Deng Xiaoping's opening up. Therefore, I posed a question: how will it use its influence? And I urged China to become a responsible stakeholder in that system. So I was trying to look beyond the forms of international integration to norms. What would be China's behavior? And I was trying to urge China to use its power constructively by sharing responsibilities with the United States and others. Now today, probably some of the debate that you're hearing are about charges that cooperation with China failed. So let's look at the record. In the 1950s and 60s, China was an outright enemy of the United States. We fought a war to a bloody stalemate in Korea. And China sponsored revolutions and backed proxies in North Vietnam and North Korea. Indeed, until the late 1980s, China was the world's leading proliferator of nuclear weapons and missiles. But in the 1990s, China joined international conventions on proliferation, nuclear weapons, missiles, and others, and it kept its commitments. It stopped proliferation and, in fact, worked with the United States to try to block nuclear programs in Iran and North Korea. Between 2000 and 2018, China supported 182 of 190 UN Security Council resolutions that the US sought, including many with sanctions, although some involved hard negotiations and compromise. China became the second largest funder of UN peacekeeping. When I worked on the issue of genocide in Darfur and Sudan in 2005 and 2006, China was actually quite helpful in the process. And on the economic side, China became the largest contributor to global economic growth. For 15 years, until the Trump administration, China was the fastest growing destination for US exports. China cut its global current account surplus from 10% to 0, boosting global demand. It stopped undervaluing its exchange rate. It offered the largest and quickest stimulus during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. When I was at the World Bank, it was very supportive and gave resources to the IMF and World Bank. It initiated something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which has operated constructively according to global standards. Even in areas such as humanitarian projects, China was willing to work, for example, with colleagues of mine at the Mercy Corps. And as for the World Trade Organization, China's commitments in 2001 actually far exceeded those of Brazil, India, and other developing economies. And frankly, it implemented its numerical obligations pretty well. The record for items that are harder to measure, however, is spotty. And as China's ambassador to the United States acknowledged a few years ago, the suit of clothes that the WTO, that China assumed in the WTO in 2001 no longer fits. There's a dime for more commitments. On issues like climate and the environment, China has a long way to go, but it's a leading innovator in non-fossil fuel technology, and now is making some very striking pledges, although we need to look at the implementation steps, because in areas such as coal-fired generating plants, there's still large construction. There's action on conservation issues, from elephant ivory to shark fin soup. In the aftermath of the COVID outbreak, China just closed down the wildlife markets that are clearly related to some of the spread. That's a $77 billion industry, employing some 14 million people. But frankly, I'm afraid its actions will likely push some of that trade underground unless it enforces it fully. And then take the sensitive topic of Taiwan. We've gone from artillery duels in the 1950s to Taiwan joining APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Group, and the World Trade Organization. And during my tenure, we were also able to persuade Beijing to accept Taiwan as a observer within the World Health Organization, which later they changed their policy as the tensions became greater. And while all this was happening, the US was continuing arms sales. Now, my point from this list isn't that all is well. My point is there's no holiday from diplomacy. But if one assumes that China is only a disruptor and that it won't act on its commitments, that's flat wrong. Historically, the case cannot be made, and self-deception in diplomacy and security is dangerous. But at the same time, as I cautioned in the opening, we have to see China as it is, not as we wish it to be. And when Xi Jinping assumed power in 2012, he wanted to make some big changes. This may be a surprise to Americans, but he viewed his predecessor, Hu Jintao, as leading a lost decade. And that's because he feared that cynicism, corruption, and indiscipline was eroding the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. I had a chance to meet President Xi on his rise in both China and the State Department. He visited me when he was a provincial party secretary. I saw him a number of times in Beijing and also in Hangzhou. And I had an opportunity to see him shortly after I stepped down as president of the World Bank in 2012, because I had led an effort with China on a project called China 2030, which was an effort to try to recommend the next generation of economic reforms. So shortly after Xi became president in 2012, I had a session with him and I asked him, what are your priorities for reform? And his answer was both striking and revealing. His priority, Xi replied, was the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember it because the numbers are transversed. I think the numbers are now over 90 million. Now, that's not a leader's typical answer to a question about economic reform. So Xi was signaling quite directly that he first had to reassert party control and legitimacy. I also want to share another story that I think is very revealing. When Xi took office, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in Europe. And he directed all his party cadres to see that film. Now, if Americans or Europeans commissioned such a film, Gorbachev would probably be a star as the actor who helped end the Cold War. That's not the case of the Chinese version. In that version, Gorbachev is the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, broke up his country, and led to ruin. And the not so subtle message of this documentary film is, it won't happen here. So Xi would go on to strengthen the role of the Communist Party, centralize power, and increase reliance on the state sector. In foreign policy, as I know you're aware, he very much abandoned the Deng Xiaoping adage of bide your time, hide your strength. And from my view, Xi's international strategy over the past years has followed two tracks. On the one hand, China worked within international institutions to advance its interests, its norms, its personnel. Now, frankly, this really shouldn't be a surprise. It's not unusual. Other countries do this. The unusual aspect was that at this exact moment, the United States was pulling back or even withdrawing from a number of these international institutions and regimes. China was also developing a second track, and it was preparing the option of an alternative system that was built more along the lines of China's traditional approach to international relations based on tributary relations. And under the tributary model, others could certainly benefit from China's economics and assistance and its large market, as long as China was treated with respect, and others certainly didn't criticize Beijing. And indeed, I would say that the Belt and Road process is a good example of this alternative. But I also want to take a moment to try to help you appreciate China's historical perspective, whether you agree with it or not. China believes that it suffered from humiliation of imperialist aggressors during its time of weakness during the 19th and the early 20th century, until 1949, when the Communist Party took over, whether they were European, Russian, Japanese, or American. And the lesson that the Chinese draw from this is that they have a critical need for internal stability, national unity, and I would add indeed reunification, along with economic strength and prosperity to overcome the external threats that they see. Now, it might seem ironic to outsiders who have seen the incredible rise of Chinese power, but China still has a defensive mindset. It recalls itself as the victim, and that creates a toxic brew today of grievance, nationalism, but also a superior sense that maybe China's moment has arrived. At the same time, and this is very important, if you look at Chinese actions, the leaders have demonstrated that they can act patiently and quite pragmatically. Now, when Donald Trump became president in 2017, U.S. attitudes towards China were changing, in part because large segments of the U.S. business community had cooled towards China, although they were still quite active in doing business there. There were frustrations with protections of intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, a sense of lack of reciprocal access, and unfair competition with what people described as China's state capitalism, the state-owned enterprises and the special state directions. China had launched an initiative called the Made in China 2025 initiative, which raised fears that China would dominate the technologies of the future, in part through espionage and theft. And as all of you know well, there were very impressive Chinese military buildups and aggressive actions in the South China Sea and East China Sea. At the same time, the Communist Party narrowed space for debate in China. It ignored human rights, and over time, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, cracked down in Xinjiang province, Tibet, and Hong Kong. These are notions of its sense of ensuring national unity. Trump's response was transactional, not strategic. His primary focus for the first 3 years was on the bilateral trade deficit, which economists will explain is not a very useful measure. For example, the United States has a bilateral surplus with Australia. Australia has a surplus with China. China has a surplus with the United States. So what you've really learned is you've got a different terms of trade. Or if I could give you a more sort of personal example, I have a trade deficit with my supermarket, but I don't stock shelves at night to have an offsetting surplus. I earn money somewhere else, and that's the nature of international trade. Now, after 3 years, President Trump struck a so-called first phase trade deal. It's really a pledge to purchase amounts from the United States, as opposed to traditional deals which try to focus on rules and fair competition. And at the year end, China's purchases were only about half of the expected amounts. And the problem with managed trade is that about 30% of US exports weren't even covered, and they actually fell with double-digit numbers. So at least so far, that managed trade package falls far short of what the aims were. However, with the COVID-19 outbreak, President Trump was obviously worried about the politics, and he shifted to a full-bore confrontation with China. And his officials sought to rationalize many of these somewhat haphazard actions with a concept that I'm sure you've been studying in early Defense Department reports of great power competition. Now, if the logic is great power competition, the starting point is to be aware that condemnation isn't the same as competition. Critically, the Trump administration failed to enlist partners. To the contrary, the United States cajoled and threatened America's traditional allies. The US was also competing primarily in security terms. And this ignores something quite important in the Asian context, and that is the rise over the past decades has been based on economics, including over recent years, the creation of a much stronger intra-Asian market that doesn't depend on exports to the United States. And in the economic world, China has the advantages of geography and what trade people will call the local economic gravity, the pulls of the local market. Unfortunately, President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been negotiated over the Bush and Obama administrations, which would have helped promote US economic rules and standards with 11 other economies across the Asia Pacific. The agreement was actually built off prior free trade agreements dating back to my tenure as USTR. 6 of the 11 we'd already had free trade agreements with, and it's an example of how the United States can use rules and standards in agreements to sort of expand the rules-based system regionally. I believe that Trump's confrontational approach is based fundamentally on a zero-sum or even a lose-lose logic. And it also raises another question that the Biden administration will have to deal with, and that is there any room for cooperation with China on common interests, whether they be climate change, biological security and future pandemics, or economics? And frankly, a realist shouldn't be surprised if China will no longer assist us in the case of sanctions or other actions with Iran and North Korea if we treat it as an enemy. President Trump personally never seemed to care about the human rights issues, but his appointees over the last year have used the cause of freedom as a club, as a way to insult China, not so much the direction that Reagan tried to push at the end of the Soviet Union about calling for aspirations of free people. And in fact, if you read Secretary Pompeo's closing statements, he blames the Communist Party of China for all differences. This is tricky. It could actually lead the Chinese to conclude that the United States policy is regime change, and that's a very serious step with China. And frankly, over the past year, while we've been preoccupied with pandemic and politics, US-China relationship has been in free fall. And we frankly haven't yet seen what the bottom is, and that's dangerous. Now, during the course of 2020, China has not stood still while we've been focusing on things in the United States. And in particular, students of Chinese history will know that natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, famines, or plagues have often signaled the end of dynasties. Well, this didn't escape Xi Jinping. And so he acted quite firmly in response to COVID-19. And frankly, the sense in China is he's been successful. And that success has probably fed a confidence, even a hubris, but that is still tinged with some of those insecurities that I mentioned. Over the course of the past year, the Chinese Communist Party launched a new education and rectification campaigns. These are reminiscent of some of the steps during the Mao's years. And of course, this allowed President Xi to further limit and in some case prosecute his opposition. Late last year, Xi was anointed a helmsman, which for those of you that know something about Chinese history was the appellation applied to Mao. And interestingly, the Central Committee took no steps to signal a successor, likely setting Xi Jinping up at least to have the opportunity to be leader for life, and when the next term of offices ends in 2022. The recent party platform communicated a stress on security, economics, political, cultural, social, and it's a long list. And the principal Politburo ideologue warned of, quote, sabotage, subversion, and splitism. The guiding theme for next year's 5-year plan, which would be the 14th, is labeled dual circulation. What does this mean? Well, the concept seems to reflect a traditional Chinese belief in self-reliance. That's probably a reaction to COVID-19 and some of the US efforts to decouple economically. I'd expect more vertical integration of domestic supply chains with China, and certainly a focus on strategic emerging industries. Yet China is also looking to an active international role, and it'll be interesting to watch how it balances these. It recently completed a RCEP, this is a regional comprehensive economic program, trade agreement on 15 Asian economies, which I hasten to add the US is not part of. It's suggested for trade agreements with Japan and South Korea. And it's even hinted at maybe trying to join the successor of the TPP, which Japan and the other 10 economies proceeded with when the United States dropped out. And of course, there's the Belt and Road program. I think going forward, one topic to pay particularly close attention to, you might have seen in the news that the EU just completed a new investment accord with China. At a minimum, that is an effort to try to push and leverage away from the US pressure, but it might also have serious steps to open up which are worth watching in case the United States wishes to piggyback on them. Now, I might try to characterize these moves as globalization with Chinese characteristics. I think China will continue its close connectivity with the international economy. It certainly wants the links to technology. It sees opportunities in international markets. But at the same time, if the ties with foreign firms, if they become more dependent on China, give Beijing some opportunity to deter foreign action or to leverage them. Sad to say, I think Xi and the Chinese leadership has become quite cynical about the Western democracies. They probably decided that the United States cannot accept China's rise, regardless of what China does. And even a debate you probably heard about the so-called Thucydides trap has probably prompted Chinese strategists to conclude that America, the existing power, was bound to react with hostility to China as the rising power. Therefore, according to Beijing, the acrimony of today arose from America's weakness, not China's behavior, which I think is a mistaken conclusion. The recent plenum, however, in China looks to, quote, a profound adjustment in balance of power. Yet for all this positioning, Beijing still has a defensive quality in its approach. Chinese leaders recognize the country faces significant weaknesses. Internally, especially in the territorial fringe, where you've seen some of these crackdowns. Demographically, because of the one-child policy, China will turn old before it turns rich, and it's got some very severe environmental problems. So Beijing will seek economic strengthening to maintain its internal cohesion, but it also believes it needs to continue to counter foreign intrusion to perpetuate regime legitimacy. As for China's external aims, I suspect it wants to be the predominant power in much of Asia. That would include the Western Pacific, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Russia. Beyond these areas, I think it's more of a question, because I think Chinese policy looks more reactive and opportunistic. Chinese culture centers on the exceptionalism of the Han people, and that's not the seeds of a soft power strategy. China's communist ideology looks more Chinese in spirit than Marxist universalism, and one way to think about that is the Vietnamese Communist Party doesn't see much fraternal brotherhood. I think China will promote the power and effectiveness of its development model, of which it's quite proud, combined with the surveillance state and repression. But I think relations with other states seem more based on cold calculation than the notion of some shared values. And we've seen Chinese bullying increase, I think, as a function of the Xi Jinping approach and attitude, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which looks increasingly threatening to others and I think backfires on China. And this leads to an important question that all of us will be examining over the course of the next years, and that is, will China's expansionist policies actually create contradictions with China's aim of fostering sustainable economic growth? Which brings me to some concluding points about what approach the United States might take and what might the United States offer to the rest of the world. First, America's success in any strategy must start at home. And I'll just observe today that we've got some work to do. And if you recall any one lesson from your time at National Defense University, I hope it is to take your oath to uphold the Constitution with utmost seriousness, respect, and honor. Furthermore, America's traditional source of strength has flown from its openness to ideas, to goods and competition, to finance and people. All societies make mistakes. Open societies are more likely to recognize them, face them, and correct them. I don't believe the United States will compete successfully with China through a race to the bottom of barriers, controls, and suspicion. Our universities and our companies should draw the world's talent. And at the same time, we need to offer an opportunity to every American to reach his or her potential. Second, and this is very important after the past 4 years, America gains strength, insights, and resilience through its allies and partners. For over 70 years, the United States led an alliance system that enabled the United States to mobilize support for core strategic interests. And the key part of this is at the same time that the system served US interests, it enabled the partners to advance their interests. Now, frankly, there's a lot of warm language written about alliance leadership. I've spent much of my career doing it. I served with Secretary Baker at the end of the Cold War with her negotiated the unification of Germany, very difficult times with our allies and partners. It's not easy. It requires a special approach about listening, treating with respect, and frankly, compromising on secondary issues while focusing on your strategic objectives. And important from a strategic perspective to recognize that these partnerships will have political and economic as well as military features. And I think increasingly they're going to need to address the so-called new security issues, such as biological security, cyber, climate, outer space, as well as the traditional ones, which also remain important. Third, I suspect that the US military posture in the Pacific will also need to adapt, and I believe it's already begun to do so. Now, many of you are much more expert on this, but from what I've observed, China's push for military primacy in the Western Pacific is based on an anti-access area denial strategy. And with missiles, submarines, and sensors, it wants to threaten US forces and waters that China wants to control. So I believe the United States in turn must develop its own deterrence and anti-access strategy based on more distributed submarine, unmanned platforms, standoff weapons. And you'll see a big debate over the future years, including with the new administration, about how quickly the United States is moving to this new posture. It's always hard for big institutions to change. Now, in particular, I want to flag that I think Taiwan could pose an especially serious operational and strategic problem. I could conceive of various steps that China might take, short of an actual invasion, that could in effect quarantine Taiwan, forcing the decision to escalate on the United States or accepting Taiwan's loss of autonomy. From what I've understood in discussion with retired naval officers, I think US options and logistics will depend very heavily on Japan. But Japan faces a conundrum. If China were able to compel Taiwan to cede its present autonomy, Japan's confidence in the US security guarantee and its own security would suffer greatly, with implications we can only begin to hazard. But at the same time, I doubt whether the Japanese political culture is prepared to act in support of the US in the event of a Taiwan crisis. So over the next years, I think you'll see calls for much more serious planning and preparations with Japan. And these will extend beyond the military because ultimately, in terms of trying to make choices about protecting Taiwan, the publics in both the United States and Japan have to be willing to support. But I would also caution US leaders to think carefully about our national interests with Taiwan. We have to ask ourselves, what are our core objectives that we need to protect while avoiding provocations that could push everyone over the edge? Recall, I gave the Chinese perspective on history and splitism and the dangers of national integrity, and Taiwan is a key part of its long-term unification strategy. My own preference is to speak softly and carry a big stick. I'm afraid most recently, including the news of today, is we're speaking more than we're preparing to back it up. Fourth, I hope your studies at NDU will help you prepare for thinking about US strategic interests in the first decades of the 21st century. Well over a century ago, Alfred Thayer Mahan advocated that America's maritime, security, and commercial interests in the Western Pacific could be served by a security perimeter that extends to the islands of the Western Pacific. Now, after the Korean War, the United States added the Republic of Korea as a continental outpost, in part because it's vital to Japan's security and stability throughout Northeast Asia. As Michael Green, a former senior director at the NSC and the author of an excellent history on U.S. foreign policy in Asia, summarized, quote, "The real objective of U.S. grand strategy in the Pacific was the prevention of a hostile hegemon from dominating the region, whether that was Japan, Russia, or today China." It's interesting, though, that Mahan didn't rely solely on naval strength. He argued that trade liberalization contributed to America's influence in East Asia. In 1890, Mahan wrote, "The tariffs were like, quote, a modern ironclad with heavy armor but inferior engines and guns. Mighty defense for defense, but weak for offense." Mahan also recognized that values, what he called moral influence, needed to be part of America's strategy in the Far East. An empire, he explained, would not bring security if it were based on mercantilist exclusion or an exploitation rather than the advancement of individual liberty. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today, and my primary purpose has been not just to talk about Sino-American relationships, but to encourage you to pursue your strategic studies with an eye on history. What I've tried to communicate today is it's important to understand how others tried to address these problems, both in the distant and the recent past. One can learn from things they did well and problems that were still left unsolved. History, both our own, but also that of other countries, understanding how others view the world, will add to your perspective. I don't think I would expect it to give and reveal direct and simple answers, but a sense of history will help you ask questions. And I think that's a good way to face any problem, develop any strategy in the future. And so I'd be pleased to now try to address your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zoellick. I'm going to start with a question that's based on a correspondence that you and I had, a private correspondence. President Xi has proclaimed a mission to achieve dominance in a number of strategic economic sectors and technologies. And he's also stated that by 2015, China will have a world-class military, by which we interpret that to mean a military that can match the United States military. Recently, we've seen woke warrior diplomacy that's been extremely aggressive in trying to impose the Chinese narrative on global affairs. In our correspondence, you said that you don't believe that China is trying to achieve a position of global dominance. And I ask, in light of some of these facts and this behavior, is that not evidence that China is seeking a position of global dominance?
So Mike, as I mentioned in my remarks, I definitely think that China wants to have a dominant position in much of Asia, and certainly in the competition in the Western Pacific, and I would add Central Asia, and I mentioned sort of Eastern Russia. I think sometimes this is where strategic thinkers have to discipline themselves as to then the next step of the analysis. China, no doubt, wants to have influence in other parts of the world. But my own sense is that it's been acting more opportunistically, whether in the case of Latin America, the Middle East. Clearly, it wants to have leverage and influence in its relations with Europe. It wants to have both a healthy economic relationship, but also leverage points to prevent those challenging the legitimacy of the Communist Party. But that's different than a concept of world domination. And I partly distinguish this in that, as someone who served in the closing decades of the Cold War with the Soviet Union did have a communist ideology that did seek to dominate the world. I mean, Khrushchev came to the UN and said, "We will bury you," not because he expected a military conflict, although he got close to some, but because he believed that communist ideology would triumph. As I emphasized, the irony about China is the Communist Party is a source of control, and Xi is adamant about trying to keep it strong for the sake of national unity. but it's more Chinese authoritarianism than it is a communist ideology externally. Look at its relations with communist Vietnam. And this in part flows from the chauvinism of the Chinese towards the Han civilization. Look at how they treat non-Han nationalities within China. So this doesn't suggest that all the actions are all benign, but in a sense, I think the framework to use would be more of a calculation of self-interest and leverage points in other parts of the world. You know, part of the interest in the Belt and Road is developing the transport and communication systems across the heartland of Asia, as opposed to relying solely on maritime networks. I taught for a year at the Naval Academy in the late 90s, and I remember asking my midshipman students, you know, if 80 to 90% of your energy resources depended on sort of coming through the Straits of Malacca, would you be comfortable with the 7th Fleet leaning over your supply lines? So these are all strategic dimensions, and frankly, you know, some of China's interest in developing alternative energy sources is to be able to protect itself from leverage points. And I emphasize, Michael, because you know, there's a tendency that when people see actions of another party look aggressive, to immediately sort of assume that the other side is trying to dominate the situation. That may be, but they may be also reacting to what they believe are the threats that that others have posed. And so what I'm trying to outline here for China is that I think the US would be best placed if it worked with allies and partners, not only in the Asia Pacific and with India and with Europe, to both deter Chinese behavior, but also to open pathways, as I've tried to suggest, where you can have win-win solutions. There have been a lot of those in the past. And in a practical way, I would just pose the question back to others. If we're concerned about nuclear weapons in Iran or in North Korea, how do you think you're going to be able to deal with that problem if you don't at least have some degree of cooperation with China on these issues? So I'm trying to stretch people to think not just in terms of a bilateral relationship, but look at all the pieces on the chessboard.
Thank you very much, sir. I have a question from the audience here. Regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, do you see this as extending into sub-Saharan Africa, including into the Sahel?
I think the Belt and Road Initiative, like many sort of big moves in China, started out as a slogan from Xi Jinping, and it's taken some time for people to fill it in. And as they fill it in, they encounter different mistakes and lessons along the way. And you actually, I remember discussing with some private sector companies in China a year or two ago about Belt and Road, and they were quite skeptical about it. They felt they'd invest what they had to, but they said, look, why should we be investing in those poor countries as opposed to the United States and Europe where we can make more money? So this is where sort of the Chinese entrepreneurialism is not to be underestimated. Whether you call it Belt and Road or whether you call it sort of a deeper economic engagement in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, and in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, it's partly based on interest in commodity markets. There's certainly you're going to see more of a Chinese presence in all parts of the world. You and I were talking, Michael, a little bit before we began about, you know, COVID having limited our travel and our perspective. What I just want to emphasize, perhaps for a lot of officers who served in Asia, they'll have the sense, you know, we've kind of lost sight of, you know, the economic dynamism and power that is still going forward in Asia. I was on a call late last night for 4 hours with people in Singapore. This is part of an economic reality that we have to factor into our calculations. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, the Chinese presence creates influence, but also creates potential problems. So when I was at the World Bank, I tried to warn the Chinese. They said, look, if your investments are seen as displacing Africans, not creating opportunities for African workers, you're going to get a blowback. And you've seen this in some countries, for example, in Zambia. The response of some people is to attack the idea of the Chinese economic engagement in Africa. I think that is not going to be successful. I mean, to be honest, Africans are going to say, who are Americans or Europeans to tell us who we should do business with, particularly given some of the history of American and European firms over the course of a century. I think the wiser policy, it's the one I tried to pursue at the World Bank, was to say to the Africans, look, here are issues you have to watch out for about debt buildup, contracts that are sort of taking advantage of government guarantees, and help them develop the capacity to engage in these activities. And this includes the important issue of fighting corruption. And I'll go relate this more broadly to Belt and Road. On a couple of years ago, I was invited by the China Development Forum to talk about, I think it was the 40th anniversary of the launch of reforms. And I used Belt and Road as an interesting example. I said, look, no one knows what it is. Is it a geopolitical venture? Is it a way to use excess capacity? Is it a development plan? It's probably all three of these. And I used, I said, look, when you decided to launch that, you actually hired a number of people, my former colleagues at the World Bank, because you wanted to operate with global governance standards. I said, so why don't you apply the same principles to Belt and Road? Why don't you have transparency, open procurement, anti-corruption, better environmental standards? And interestingly enough, the head of the People's Bank of China told me he gave the speech to Xi Jinping. And the next year, Xi Jinping actually made a lot of these points in his speech at the Belt and Road Forum. But this is where the lack of work with China on follow-up hurts us. After he said those things, the United States should have worked with Japan, Europe, and others to say, okay, let's hold you to your word. How can we be certain that transparency, anti-corruption, not going to stop Belt and Road? The question is whether you can sort of push it in a direction where it's more constructive for global development, less an opportunity for just extension of Chinese power. And I'm trying to emphasize these points in that over the past 4 years, in a sense, some people have patted themselves on the back and saying, well, now we've figured out that China is a threat and we're going to confront China. Well, that's all nice and well and good, but how? And with whom? And with what aims? And how we're going to cooperate? Those are the complexities of a strategy that's going to be successful over the long term.
Thank you, sir. We have a question. What more can be done through the blend of economic and military instruments of power? Specifically, who in the India-Pacific region, say, who are the top two that we should be focusing our efforts on and these tools besides India?
Well, obviously, the keys are first our traditional allies and economic powers, Japan and Korea. We have a free trade agreement with Korea, which was one of the series that I had initiated way back in 2001. Japan would have been included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but we didn't follow through. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership was important because it also drew in some of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think we need to look at Southeast Asia as a very important economic and political player. Certainly with the South China Sea, it's also part of our sort of security framework. And so I think the key here is trying to integrate, whether it be the Japanese, Korean, Southeast Asian relationship. India will be a complex one. People who know India well, and I've worked a lot with India over the years, recognize this is a country that has its own very strong sense of sovereignty and independence after coming out as a British colony. And there's a prickliness about it. So from a geopolitical sense, India will be a partner with the United States. I was part of the effort to work through the nuclear reactor and proliferation program, so we didn't have sanctions and accepted India's nuclear role, sort of late in the Bush 43 administration. But at the same time, we need to moderate our expectations. because India is going to be sensitive to not simply being sort of controlled by the United States, just as it might have been controlled by Britain and others. These all go to the challenge of an Asian diplomacy that isn't focused simply on China. And Richard Armitage, who many people may know as a former naval officer, Defense Department official, State Department official, has made the point, a good one, that kind of the path to dealing with China runs through the rest of Asia.
Thank you, sir. Question coming from Steve Schinkel at the Naval War College. What benefits does China seek to achieve by referring to itself as a developing country versus a developed country, especially in areas such as the Paris Climate Accords? Is it fair to consider China a developing country?
Well, breaking this into two parts, by calling itself a developing country, it wants to recognize that its obligations will be less than the developed countries. Formally in the World Trade Organization, developing countries are allowed to have what's been termed special and differential treatment. Those terms are defined terms. What they basically mean is kind of less in the way of obligations. And the WTO has never defined exactly who gets to declare themselves as a developing country. So I think the reality is, on trade and economic matters, China's success will, if we work with others, either bilaterally, regionally, or through the WTO, should push China towards reciprocal obligations. There's a similar pattern developing in the climate change area. Under President Obama, China was reluctant to make formal commitments about carbon in years because it made the point that the industrialized countries had had decades where they were able to produce CO2 and other greenhouse gases as part of their development. They reached a stage of development more reliant on service industries than some of the traditional industries heavily reliant on energy. And so it didn't have the same obligations. What's worth watching is that, in fact, over the course of the past year, Xi Jinping made commitments about China's being carbon neutral in 2050. That's a long way off. And the question will be, what are the interim steps? And I alluded to the fact it's still building a lot of coal-fired electricity generating plants. But it's starting to fill those in. And this could be an interesting area where China, feels these two pushes that I've mentioned. On the one hand, it feels that it still has many challenges of development, which it does for people who've gone beyond Beijing and Shanghai and others. At the other hand, it also wants to be seen as a leader in the system. So frankly, this is an area where diplomatically, the United States and others should be pressing China to assume stronger obligations. At the same time, we should be encouraging China and recognizing when it does so.
Thank you, sir. Carl Lallerstadt from the Confederation of Swedish Enterprises asks, he begins by saying, it would appear that the key to balancing China for the global open democracies would be to cooperate more effectively amongst themselves, presenting a more united front. How do you see the long-term prospects for closer economic integration between the United States, the European Union states, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership states?
So that's a very good point. I think you'll see the new Biden administration try to work along these lines. The United States already has significant economic integration with Europe and with Asia Pacific. I think you'll see the challenge most, and the barriers among us are relatively low, although Trump increased them again using sort of his national security authority. And my guess is the administration might sort of over time seek to remove some of those. The bigger challenges relate to sort of the cutting edge of the world economy. And this will increasingly be in the digital space. So I still work with a number of companies, serve on boards, and I just can't emphasize enough that every company that I know, and the pandemic of COVID-19 has actually accelerated this, has to be deeply involved with strategies for its its digital services and how it applies AI and other technologies kind of to its future business model. And this is an area where the international rules are still relatively undeveloped. It's part of the point that I've tried to make in some of these sessions and others, why it's important for the United States to play an active role in negotiating agreements. Because in general, the United States is a leading edge economy. That means a lot of our business sectors encounter these issues, whether they be intellectual property rights or issues of data transferability or data location. And traditionally, the United States tried to lead in setting up new standards and norms for these. Even the question of, for example, technical applicability of different systems like the wireless internet. The move of protectionism in the United States over the past 4 years kind of took us out of that game. And if you go back and you look at the TPP I mentioned, it actually had some of the more developed rules on sort of data transfer systems. But at the same time, I think the economy is moving fast and the technologies are moving fast. And the rules and norms haven't caught up. And so particularly with Europe, for example, you have issues now of digital taxes, you have different questions of privacy. The challenge will be, if I were the trade representative going forward, I'd be focusing as much on trying to develop a framework for digital trade and economics that's respected decisions on privacy and other security systems. And that will be a key issue for US relations with Europe as well as Japan. And if we're not doing that role, you'll start to see increased fragmentation. And this can take different forms. So for example, since the questioner is from Sweden, you would know that some of the European regulations, for example, on the GDPR, which is a data and privacy protection regime, have started to be adopted by other countries because there's an absence of a noble system. Now, frankly, GDPR is actually sort of increasingly out of date. And you're seeing a move now to have debate some of these issues with the European Commission, European Parliament. You're going to see them in the case of the US Congress as well. So I think the challenge here is for the United States in using the strategic approach I mentioned to try to work with its key partners, primarily the democracies in the Asia Pacific as well as in Europe, to try to see if we can develop appropriate norms. And these will become influential also for China as it pursues its own sort of splitternet policies. It'll either have to accept the norms or it'll pay the price of not doing so. When you get into the technical details, this becomes not such an easy thing to accomplish. But I think that you'll see the Biden administration, I would predict, try to start with some work out with democracies, particularly in Europe, to try to come up with an approach towards the security of cyber systems and data. I would encourage them also to expand it to some of the sort of economic transferability of data issues.
Thank you, sir. This from Leif Rosenberger from the Modern War Institute at West Point. President Trump blamed China for U.S. unemployment in the Rust Belt. A Ball State University study says that 85% of U.S. jobs were lost to technology and not to trade. Who's right?
Well, this is a big subject of debate. I'm glad that Leif and I have been in contact over the course of a number of years. Most economists believe that it's based on technology changes. But the whole issue of technology and trade, as my comments have suggested, start to become interconnected. And the real issue is there are many ways in which as people move from one sector to another, you're going to have job loss. In 1900, the United States probably had about 40 to 50% of its employment in agriculture. Today, we probably have about 1%, but we're far more productive. You've seen this in the manufacturing industry. There's a lot of talk about manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing jobs have come down as manufacturing productivity increased. So as a share of the GDP, the manufacturing sector still stays, I think, at around 20%, maybe high teens. That's a natural development. And you have to start to ask yourself, at a time where perhaps 50% of the value of a car is software, is that manufacturing or is that service industry? The larger point here is societies that are going to adapt to change, going to continue to create opportunities for their citizens and wealth and value added, have to have internal systems to help people adapt. And this goes to issues that start with sort of education and training and opportunities. And the United States has not accomplished what it needs to in this area. But as a general point, I'll say, when you hear politicians blaming others for America's sort of problems, it's a good time to check your wallet. Normally, we have to start at home to figure out what we have to do to improve.
Thank you, sir. What are the first central messages and themes you think President Biden and his Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of Commerce should communicate to China in the initial weeks of the administration? And how much of this do you think should be communicated publicly?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me set the context for it. And I've written some things along these lines in Foreign Affairs Online and the Wall Street Journal. Any student of the American political system knows that a president has limited bandwidth on the agenda. The president has to work with Congress. There's certain amounts of things you can do of an executive order nature. President-elect Obama or Biden faces a huge domestic agenda. He's got a pandemic where our vaccine sort of distribution is not working as it should be. He's got an economic recovery. He's got racial issues. He's got climate issues. He's got immigration issues. It's a full plate. My first advice would be drawn from advice that one of my former bosses, James Baker, gave to Reagan in 1981. He said, "Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, economic recovery, and economic recovery." And if you recall, the early Reagan administration actually didn't take steps on foreign policy until it got the economy sort of back on track. So the national success, and frankly, Biden's political success, depends heavily on the in the race to get the vaccines out before we get mutations that spread this epidemic further, and the nature of the economic recovery. Second, I would say that my approach towards China would not be to stand off, but to recognize that my first priority, as I've suggested in my remarks, is to try to see if we can get greater alignment with our allies. Let me use another historical example about this. I was working with Secretary Baker at the State Department in 1989 at the time of Gorbachev, and you'll hear historians debate again today, did the United States pause in terms of reaching out to Gorbachev in '89? What they overlook was that the first step was to reinforce our position with our allies. The INF agreement, which had eliminated intermediate range missiles in Europe, left only short range missiles, which, as the Germans said, the shorter the missiles, the deader the Germans. And NATO was committed to modernize those missiles. So we had to deal with the German politics at the same time that Germany was feeling the appeal of Gorbachev. And Bush 41 came up with a very bold conventional forces initiative that changed the whole nature of that relationship. So we spent the first months trying to focus on our allies while we were planning out the reach to Gorbachev. I would draw a comparison here. As we've sort of discussed, I think the starting point is to repair some of the relationships with both the Indo-Pacific allies as well as with Europe. And with China, I would basically make some of the themes that I've suggested today, which is to point out the areas where we think that Chinese behavior, whether in security terms or in economic terms, needs to adapt and change. Areas for cooperation, recognize that we're going to have differences to manage. And this will point, for example, in the military area to some of the discussions about things like incidents at sea agreements, so we avoid a crisis that might be created by an unexpected event. In the economic area, I alluded to the EU-Chinese investment agreement. I haven't yet been able to see in full kind of the terms of that agreement. It could be quite illustrative as to where China realizes it needs to move on items. And so let me just give you two specific examples. US companies have complained about intellectual property rights violations in China, justifiably. Interestingly enough, over the past years, China created intellectual property courts in China that are finding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time. The problem is the penalties aren't high enough. So I would be negotiating higher penalties so as to try to protect intellectual property. And not surprisingly, as China moves up the technology curve, it understands the need to have greater intellectual property protection. Another issue is forced technology transfer, that companies are forced to transfer their technology to do business in China. This is clearly prohibited by their WTO accession accord. But when I was in the US government, we had a hard time getting US companies to give us the evidence because they were fearful of retaliation. I suspect a lot of these problems arise out of the joint venture requirements. If you eliminate the joint venture requirements, you'll have less pressure to transfer the technology. And I've read that the European agreement removes a lot of the joint venture requirements. Now, what I'm suggesting here is the devil is in the details of a lot of these items. At the early stage, frankly, I would engage with the Chinese at the strategic level, which is to make clear, as I've tried to touch on today, where we see opportunities, biological security, climate, perhaps some of the economic issues, but also where we see the differences and how we need to try to manage them. And then while setting those out, I would look for ways to have off-ramps from some of the controversies that the Trump administration has been sort of seeding, where just you create tensions and conflicts without prospect of resolution. So I would try to sort of minimize the dangers that those issues could explode on you, while I tried to strengthen my position with allies and see if we could get some core agreement on some of the security and economic issues. And finally, as I alluded in my remarks, I always believe that the United States should stand for its values. I've been a little troubled by the way that some of the leading officials kind of use those issues simply as a way of pounding on China. And let me give you a specific example. Given my reference to China's territorial integrity, no one could be surprised that China has clamped down on Hong Kong, which was a British colony taken away from China after the Opium Wars. And it is clearly incorporating Hong Kong into mainland China in a formal way. So frankly, I believe economically we should no longer differentiate Hong Kong from the rest of China. But at the human level, rather than just applying sanctions to leaders, I would offer the opportunity for people from Hong Kong to come to the United States, as Britain has done. What better way to signal the difference between a free and an unfree society? And frankly, the United States would be better off by having more of those people come to the United States. They're entrepreneurial, innovative, and hardworking. So my point is, the United States should stand for the aspirations of freedom, but it should seek to try to do so in a way that realizes that over the long term, the question of China's future has not been fully settled. And when we do things that insult the Chinese people, I don't think we're serving our long-term interests in China's transformation.
Thank you, sir. This question comes from S. Vaitla at the State Department. Can China's desire for an exclusive sphere of influence in parts of Asia coexist with our desire for a neoliberal trading system?
The short answer is no, because you mentioned exclusive. And before I'd focus on the economic, I'd focus on the security. As you and I mentioned in the exchange, Michael, I think China would like to have a hegemony in East Asia. I think as long as Japan's around, that's not going to occur. And if the United States stands by Japan as an ally, and South Korea and Australia, and signal to the ASEAN countries who don't want to have to pick sides that that we will try to maintain both an active economic relationship as well as the security relationship that the Seventh Fleet has provided, although we will now provide it in different ways. So it's exactly goes to the strategic point when I mentioned about Mahan. I think, frankly, we have an interest in preserving access to the islands of the Western Pacific perimeter. We will be competing with China, but competing doesn't necessarily mean one creates a point of conflict. And I think the Chinese will react if they understand that others will push back on some of these security topics. That's why I highlighted the Taiwan issue, because I think over the next few years, that is likely to be the greatest hotspot. And when we push Taiwan to suggest that we might support Taiwanese independence, you're playing with fire with China. And that's why, in my view, as I was hinted, our strategic objective with Taiwan should be to maintain its autonomy, to help it maintain its free market economy, its network of transnational ties. But we have to be very careful to suggesting that we're going to treat Taiwan as an independent country, because you will force a Chinese reaction. And I also hinted that I'm not sure we've played out operationally how we would deal with that.
Ironically, I think we have gamed that out and pretty consistently not been very happy with the outcome. The next question is from Tom Searle from U.S. Special Operations Command. The CCP and Xi's commitment to Han exceptionalism seem to put it on a collision course with everyone. Has Xi left enough room for his diplomats to back down without endangering domestic support? Or is he painting his foreign policy into a corner where they have to continue the wolf warrior model, even as it leads them to recurring failure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Remember, Xi has got total control. So Xi can act pragmatically when he decides to do so, and they will, and they have. So he can rein in this behavior, and he also, through propaganda and their control of the information systems, they can deal with their sort of the rising nationalism. I think, however, and this is a symptom of the political system that he has created, what I've observed with this wolf warrior diplomacy is that it's a younger generation that is responding to the political signals from on top. And I've noticed with some of the older Chinese diplomats, some of the ones that I worked with over the years, they're not really comfortable with this. They can see that it's going to create problems for them. But people respond to the incentives. Now, one of the problems of Xi's centralized power is I sometimes wonder about his information sources. You could see this with the start of COVID-19. People in Hunan province were afraid to report bad information up the chain. You know, all of you as officers have encountered this in your life, is that, you know, you have to create an environment where people will give you bad news, even if people would prefer not to hear it. And I think that Xi's centralization of control and the squashing of opposition has created a problem within China's internal system. Having said that, I would never underestimate the leadership's ability to act practically and pragmatically. This European-China economic deal is clearly a partial response to sort of U.S. pressure. It may also be a response by some of the reformers to try to open up the system. So I tried to underscore sort of the Chinese view of history so that people could understand how the leadership would use it and manipulate it. And it does become a factor, of course, in the leadership's thinking. You know, whether it's a dragon that they start to ride and can't get off, that's an interesting question to sort of watch over time.
Thank you. This question comes from an anonymous questioner, but related to your comment on South Korea, what are your thoughts on the emerging idea of the Quad Plus?
Well, I'm not sure which, there's different quads. In the Korean context, so are you talking about the US, Japan, Australia, India sort of relationship with Korea? Well, strategically, we'd be far better off if South Korea and Japan have better relations. This is, we know the history of this, we know the court decisions, we know the frustrations. The United States should be trying to do all that it could to sort of ameliorate these tensions. There's clearly sort of a common interest in doing that. And I think over the longer term, it's good for both the Republic of Korea and the United States for Korea to operate on a wider stage. When I was at the World Bank, President Lee of Korea was the chair of the G20, and he recognized this. Because I was involved with German unification during the 90s, I met a lot of Koreans trying to understand the context as how it might be applied on the Korean Peninsula. And one of they're very different situations, but one of the lessons was the Federal Republic of Germany had created a positive external context in which unification could occur. And even so, there were a lot of anxieties in Britain and France and others in 1989. Korea needed to try to do that with sort of its regional partners and play a larger role on the international stage. And I think Korea's leaders have tried to take that step. There's another part that I would focus on, which this is something, as you may recall, Michael, I drew a reference to this in my book when I had the chapter on the Washington Naval Conference, 1921-22. I tried to emphasize that it was a mistake to look at this solely as a question of naval arms control. It was also an issue about dealing with regional security in Northeast Asia. And whether it goes back to the Russo-Japanese War, the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, it's important to look upon that Korea as, in a sense, the heart of a larger regional security issue. What that suggests to me is that in dealing with North Korea, we frankly need to have dimensions that are north-south. We need to have dimensions that are economic. We need to have dimensions that are humanitarian. But we also need to have a security framework that deals with the understandable interests of China, Russia, Japan, and the United States, as well as the Koreas. So over the longer term, if one does want to try to make headway with North Korea, and I'm not convinced we could, but if one did, I think you need to see this as more than a nuclear arms control issue. You need to see it as a broader regional security issue. And for example, one thing I suggested would be, as in the case of the end of the Cold War in Europe, you might actually want to start with some of the conventional weapons and sort of have a build down of some of the conventional forces on the peninsula to sort of build confidence. And I would draw another analogy to this for people thinking about the Iran issue today. I think one of the problems that the Obama administration had with the Iran nuclear accord was that they might have had a broader strategic context, but the nuclear accord ignored the larger security questions for the Gulf countries, Iran's behavior, missiles, its expeditionary behavior through insurgent forces. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is that I think the nature of diplomacy has to embed arms control in a larger security effort, not suggesting that these are easy to do, but I think without it, arms control is likely to become a technical exercise and not achieve the security goals.
Thank you, sir. We're running out of time. There are just two more questions I'd like to give you a chance to address. This one's coming from Lieutenant Colonel Al-Hamdani from the College for International Security Affairs at NDU. He asks, do you think China will become the hegemonic state in Africa and the Middle East, especially with the unremarkable presence of the United States? And what needs to be done to counter the hegemonic influence of China in Africa and the Middle East?
So let's take each one. In the case of Africa, the Africans don't want to be dominated by anybody. So I think the approach here is to support Africans recognizing kind of their own interests vis-a-vis China, recognizing that Chinese investment can become a positive, but it goes to the issues that I mentioned about whether we can help the Africans have both alternatives and how they negotiate with the Chinese about issues of state guarantees, debt buildup, corruption, employment linkages. And frankly, this would also be in the interest of China. So I don't think China will become a hegemonic power in Africa. The extent of its influence depends on fundamentally the Africans and the alternatives that we and others provide them. I've always found in situations like this that lecturing people on what to do and kind of how they need to be fearful of America's foes is less productive than offering them constructive alternatives. In the case of the Middle East, I'm not sure that China wants to become a hegemonic power. I think it looks upon the Middle East as a cauldron of trouble. So I think it sees that it has certain interests in the Middle East. Its lines for energy security. But frankly, I think China has probably looked upon the wider Middle East as a quagmire that drew U.S. attention to the greater Middle East to the exclusion of some of the efforts we should have been making in the Far East. And again, this is where I think one has to be a little careful in that, you know, the United States, China, and others have huge influence. They can be very significant militarily, economically, sometimes politically, although we've stumbled on that in recent years. But we shouldn't overstate the ability to transform other societies and countries. I think the challenge now for the Biden administration in the wider Middle East will be to build on some of the relationships that the Gulf states and Egypt have developed with Israel, and see if one can develop a security framework that deals with the anxieties coming out of Iran. Having said that, I think the impulse of American politics is to be somewhat weary of the Middle East, and you could see that over the Obama and the Trump administrations. So going back to that question about U.S. priorities, I think you'll see the Biden administration sort of focus first on home, second on allies, third on the transnational issues of climate and biological security and others. And it will seek to manage some of these regional security questions without getting totally absorbed in them.
Thank you. Just one last question, and this is for the developmentalists among us. The African human rights advocate Chidi Odin Kalu recently said the model of authoritarian developmentalism has come from China, and it comes with a spigot of Chinese money. This relates to something that you and I discussed briefly once before. With the growing influence of China in multilateral development organizations and their creation of the International Infrastructure Bank, are the Chinese, are they developing a new philosophy or a new ideology for development, for economic and political development?
Well, they have developed, they have considered a developmental model where the state plays a much larger role. And they've not tried to hide this. There have been various books and articles written about it. And to a degree, China stands as a success up to a certain level. The challenge, and partly will be even today, as Xi exerts more state-centered authority and party authority on the private sector, whether this will help China compete in more innovative stage of development. I mean, the average per capita income in China today it's about $10,000. I think in the United States it's $40,000 to $50,000. You often saw that state-directed systems could get you to a certain point. Whether they can get you to the cutting edge of the modern economy is a question mark going forward. I think in the case of Africa, frankly, there's some sense that the Chinese sloshing around a lot of money has created problems as much as successes for them. recognize that economists now are worried about many developing countries having overextended themselves in debt. And there you see discussions in the IMF that have gone on over the past year about sort of debt restructuring, including in sub-Saharan African countries, where the Chinese are going to have to take losses on these things. And I remember actually at the time I gave that speech about Belt and Road saying to the Chinese, look, you know, you have to understand, or you have to recognize, as wise financial people as they are, that a lot of this money is not going to get paid back. And when that happens, there's going to be an outcry about who owes what. And so I was urging the Chinese to become more transparent on their loans and debt, because I said, it's best to get ahead of it, because it'll come crashing down on you and you'll be blamed and you'll not be positioned to try to deal with it. That's partly occurring now. So in some ways, I think, I remember thinking about this a little bit when China was pouring money into Venezuela. I'm not sure I would have seen Venezuela as a very good investment. You know, how much of that money are they going to get back? There's no doubt that if you have money to slosh around, that it can buy influence. But as the United States has seen over time, in its own sort of past decades, that doesn't necessarily, you know, who has control when you owe a lot of money to somebody, the creditor or the debtor? and so this is where, again, I think the approach to it needs to be more for the United States, Europe, Japan, and others to offer healthy economic alternatives to a lot of these countries, that also urge them to create an economic environment that draws private business and investment. And this is going back to what we've said about these economic institutions, Michael, where there's a lot of externalities to them. The woman who now heads the UN Economic Commission on Africa is an African woman from the Cameroon who used to work with me at the World Bank. I think she may also have joined American citizenship. She's trying to create a free trade agreement across sub-Saharan Africa. These people sort of have a basic affinity with America's system and economics. And a lot of them gained the experience at institutions like the World Bank. This woman's name is Vera Songway. I've continued to try to coach and mentor on things over time. The United States, you know, should not be so down in the mouth about our ability to try to influence the direction on the basis of good ideas and principles. But it does ultimately also come back to the point that I began with in my closing point, which is the model that we send at home. And, you know, it gives me no pleasure, but the past couple of weeks have not been so good for the model the United States is sending. Now, America has huge resilience, and we'll be able to overcome this. But we need to recognize the cost that we paid. And I'll close with this, Michael, because I think I found that, particularly for the officers that are at NDU, these are going to be people who are representatives of American society. And frankly, I've always been proud to associate with America's military abroad. They stand for the right principles. They've got the right discipline. They tend to, at least in general, sort of treat their counterparts with respect. It's important as you go forward in your careers to realize at senior levels that you're military officers, but you're also representative of the United States. And with all the sort of the values, the principles, and kind of the ideology that we want to convey to the world. And that'll be true in Africa or Asia or Latin America or any other region in which you serve.
Thank you very much, sir. You have been so agile going back and forth on these various diverse questions. Ladies and gentlemen, there are still so many more interesting questions I'd like to ask, but we're out of time. So before we adjourn, I just want to thank Mr. Zoellick on all of our behalf for joining us today and taking the time to help educate us. Sir, it's been a pleasure. And I want to thank again my colleagues at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please stay well, stay strong, and stay in touch. Michael McCloudrick.
Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Zoellick, and thank you, Mr. McCloudrick.